us to focus upon you as we engage in this study. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, the book of Genesis, 46 through 50. We're having our third lesson on Joseph, because the story of Joseph, just think about it. How many chapters are in the book of Genesis about Joseph? I haven't done a comparison, but offhand, I'm just wondering if there might not be more material about him than there is Abraham, the father of the faithful, the hero of the Jewish people. But, God surely had a reason for putting all this in about Joseph's life. And I hope we have been and will continue tonight to be able to grasp some of what it's there for us for, so we can appreciate it as well. Again, the book of Genesis, nice even division here, some events that affect all mankind, and then some events involving the four patriarchs in particular here and the people who were with them. We have this chart and have had each night of Joseph's in Egypt. Even though his brothers did not plan for it to be that way, Joseph said that's the way it worked out, and he saved a lot of people's lives, including his own family. So let's start in with chapter 46 now. We'll have to talk and listen quickly tonight to get this in, but many of these things we are familiar with, I believe. Jacob travels to Egypt. Remember, we finished up the chapters where Joseph introduces himself, makes himself known to his brothers. There's a great reunion there. He's forgiving of them, and he wants the whole family to come down and be there with him, because that's where the food is, and the famine was only 2 years into it, 5 more years to go. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to God, the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again. And Joseph will put his hand on your eyes." So a great reunion, also something that was in total accord with God's plan for them. It was not going to stop God's plan simply because the promised land was going to be left now for a number of years. They were going to be coming back, and this was God's will that Jacob and his family go down there. Okay, here's a map. You see Beersheba up there in the right corner, somewhat to the southern part of the promised land, and that's where he is when God appears to him. And then they're going to have a considerable trip, making it over to Egypt, and then eventually this is Goshen. We'll talk about that more when we read those verses in a moment. It was a fertile, good land. There was no reason for it. It was not a place where Pharaoh put them because nobody wanted Goshen, so he put them there. It was a good place, especially for them with their animals that they had to feed and take care of. Okay, so he's going to make this trip, God's blessing. Now then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones and their wives in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. Pharaoh had made everything as convenient as possible because of his love and respect for Joseph. Obviously he had love and respect for Joseph's family and took good care of them. So they took their livestock and their goods which they had acquired in the land of Canaan and went to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him. And then they arrived. We're not going to read all of these verses for the sake of time to finish this in one class period. We're going to jump down to verses 26 and 27, where we're given an accounting of how many people went down. All the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. Now we're going to add to that number in just a moment. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2 persons. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were 70. Okay, where do we come up with the 70? Well, here's a chart that's as large as I can make it. Hopefully you can read it to some extent. We have the 66, of course, when you add up Jacob's other sons, their wives, their children that are listed very specifically. Those who came with Jacob into Egypt, 66. But who all went to Egypt? Well, Jacob himself went, Joseph went, and while there he had two sons. And their names were what? Manasseh and Ephraim, two of the tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? That's why there's no tribe of Joseph. There's a tribe with each of his sons. So when you add all of those up, you get that number 70. So 70 people, and how many came out? We don't have a count. But we have this number, 603,550 soldiers, fighting men. So you've got to multiply that by a factor of several for the older men, the women, the children. You know, most people think 2.5, 3 million people, the Israelites, as they left Egypt many years later and when they were freed by Moses. So it was a great nation by then. Right now, somebody might look at the promise God made and say, I don't see a great nation yet. 70 people does not a great nation make, but it's going to happen, just as God said it would. Okay, there is an emotional, a tearful reunion, and that's to be expected. Remember, for most of the time that they've been apart now, Jacob has believed that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. And in his previous trips down there, he wasn't sure that he would ever see all of his sons again in one place, because who'd they keep there as a prisoner first? Reuben? Simeon, wasn't it? I believe it was Simeon. Anyway, kept one of his sons there. And then they said, you got to bring Benjamin with you next time, or you don't get any wheat or grain. And so he was worried about Benjamin. So now he's going to be all together with all of his sons. And a great reunion. Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. Instead of going into the palace, they went straight to Goshen, it sounds like. Now, why would they do that? They had flocks and herds. They had lots of livestock. By the way, the word livestock, we believe, when you read it here in these chapters, refer to all the critters that they raised. To the sheep, to the goats, the oxen, whatever they had. You know, they were all under this broad word of livestock. And you couldn't take those into the downtown capital, you know, to meet Joseph in person. So he takes his chariot to go out there to meet them where they're going to be settling. Went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Because just as Jacob has been grieving, Joseph did not necessarily grieve because he thought everybody was dead or somebody was dead back home. He'd been separated from them for all these years. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. Powerful, emotional statement. I'm ready to die now. If God took me now, he would be taking a happy person. I've seen Joseph. I know he's still alive. I've been with all my sons this period of time, and now I see my missing son. So everything is right with the world if God wants to take me. That is how emotional and how powerful it was for Jacob in this tearful reunion. Okay, they're preparing to meet Pharaoh, and a conversation that arouses some questions. Joseph, we'll get to that patriarch here in a minute. Joseph gives them some advice about what to even say when they meet Pharaoh. And it was lawful advice, but it was for the best interest of everybody, probably. So it shall be, Joseph said, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? That you shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock. Again, abroad, you know, all the critters. Occupation has been with livestock from our youth even till now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So the territory they came to, fertile, pasture, a good place for what they were going to be doing is by way of a living with all the animals that they had. Even though there were 70 people, apparently considerably, flocks, herds, and all that. Now, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Anybody look into that? Did you read ahead and think, I wonder what that means, and look it up? Anybody do that? Well, if you had, you would find that not everybody agrees on the answer as to why this particular thing was said. It seems to be true, but it apparently did not have anything to do specifically with someone being a shepherd. One possibility, and I think probably the one that would explain it, although we can't prove it, but I think what would explain it is that the Egyptians were, well, there were a lot of people in the city. They were a pretty urban group there. They had quite a civilization. And through the years, they were, of course, surrounded, and these nomadic groups would come and go. And what were these nomadic groups? What did they do for a living? One of the things was they were shepherds, almost without fail. And so they had an automatic distrust, it would seem, of nomadic groups. Well, here comes this nomadic group from this land called Canaan, this place called Beersheba. And can we trust them? What kind of trouble are they going to cause? So that could have been their idea. Now, Pharaoh didn't feel that way, but anyway, Goshen seemed to be a good place. It was not urban, it was rural, and people had a chance to get used to these people being here, even though shepherds generally weren't appreciated because they represented a nomadic wandering tribe who might not be someone you could trust. Now, another possibility is in the reign of over Egypt, the powers in charge of it, several hundred years before this, the shepherd kings, the Hyksos, had ruled part of Egypt, which was apparently still resented to some extent, and people still remembered that, and they were somewhat kind of the same thing here. It started out nomadic people, and they were shepherds, and so you say shepherd. Oh yeah, I remember in our history what these shepherd kings did to us. Came in and tried to take over, and that could be the reason for the prejudice against someone who was a shepherd. Truth is, we don't know. The Bible doesn't explain that, and so it's one of those things that people read what they can read, find out what they can, and then they write their opinions. Whatever the reason, no reason to think that this was not true, what Joseph says here. And so the land of Goshen, this was an ideal place. This worked out great for them to be where they were, for them, for their livestock, their way of life, and some distance between some of the Egyptians who might not have appreciated them, at least till they got to know them. So, a little bit of a interesting question there, why that was, and we have a couple of possibilities for the answer. So, this is what he was going to tell Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh would say, oh yeah, land of Goshen's where you should be. Okay, let's go ahead to chapter 47, where we're going to meet Pharaoh. And Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, my father and brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen. So he has all this set up. And I suppose Pharaoh, you didn't bother Pharaoh until it was actually time to meet somebody. He wouldn't have anything to do with the arrangements. Just tell him, okay, they're here now. How would you like to meet them? And Joseph took care of the arrangements. So he took 5 men from among his brothers, and presented them to Pharaoh. And of course, the father was there too. Doesn't say which 5. We don't know. Maybe the 5 oldest. Maybe, we just don't know who they were, why he would have chosen them if we had them named for us. But he introduces part of his family at least to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? See, Joseph knew that question was coming. What do you do for a living? And perhaps for Pharaoh it was just an honest question. He was trying to find out. They said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell on the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And remember, it was. They weren't even able to plant crops. It was that bad throughout that part of the world. And Egypt was the one with the food stored up who brought salvation to a lot of folks around there. And the famine, there was no way for them to survive back in Canaan because of that. Now, therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. He presents a solution to them coming there that would seem to make everybody happy, and it did. Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you." That's kind of like saying it's yours. And remember, Pharaoh had already said that, really, hadn't he? When Joseph interpreted the dreams and the food was going to be stored, he said, "You take care of it." There was incredible trust put in someone who was not an Egyptian. You're in charge of it. And so now, hey, the land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. It seemed to be everybody's preference. And if you know of any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. Now, why would Pharaoh say something like that? What happened when Joseph was involved in some sort of business venture? It went well, okay? So no reason for Pharaoh not to think, well, you know, I bet if his family's involved in something, I'll bet it will be blessed just as well as if Joseph was doing it. Must have been thinking something like that. He says, so, you know, if you've got some people that can do it, let them take care of my livestock too. Just a reminder of what great confidence Pharaoh had in Joseph and his family because he'd seen the blessings of God. The blessings of God that fell upon Joseph and upon everybody that was around him, and even to the extent of saving all these lives during 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh was happy as can be. The other side of the equation from what the Pharaoh is going to be when Moses goes down there, you know, sometime later, right? But this Pharaoh is very pleased, and it is a great thing. He's happy for Joseph that he and his family are reunited. Then Joseph brought in his father, Jacob, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. He's going to live a little bit longer after this. "Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." In other words, you know, I've had some tough times. I've not been blessed by like some of my predecessors in the family, in the line of patriarchs. And I guess that would be a subjective decision, but it is true that several tough situations happened to Jacob. Some of them partly because of his own bad decisions, and part of them beyond his ability to change, perhaps. But he tells Pharaoh this. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. Who did the blessing back in Old Testament days? The greater or the lesser? The greater blessed the lesser, right? And so here's the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. He's the lesser. Jacob, the descendant of Abraham, the one through whom all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed, he was the greater. And his blessings apparently were something to be appreciated, and we'll come to that as we end the book, nearly into the book, as he blesses his sons, knowing that death is probably not very far away. So he blesses Pharaoh. The greater blesses the lesser. And you have to wonder what Pharaoh might have thought about that. But he might have been silent, thinking it's probably a pretty good thing from what I know about Joseph, that his father is going to bless me. Okay. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Good point. Anybody that couldn't hear that, Kendall said this is where the nation of Israel got their start. They had a place to be for 490 years and become huge. God blessed them. And God was in charge of this as Joseph received these blessings and his entire family did. And we need to remember that today, that God is in charge. No matter who's in Washington, D.C., no matter who's in other countries around the world in positions of leadership, God is still in charge. And he said something about Pharaoh's motives. I suspect, I don't know what Pharaoh's motives were, but he could have just been realizing, if you're with Joseph, things work out well. He might have been thinking about, himself. And he said, rather than the goodness of his heart. Yeah, certainly that did happen. Okay, we're going to go abbreviate a bunch of verses here, talking about Joseph's business dealings. And it's interesting, when everything is said and done, and the government has everything, the people are thankful for it. So human nature is a funny thing. The people come and say, we've got to have grain. We're starving to death, Joseph. Okay, pay for it. And remember, Joseph was in charge of the selling of grain. Okay, they came and said, Joseph, we're out of money. We don't have anything to buy grain with. All right, trade your livestock for it. So the throne owns all the livestock. They come back and said, okay, we're out of sheep and goats and cattle, out of money, but we need food. We're going to starve to death. All right, you can be servants and you can give your land, and we'll give you grain. And then we find out the priests were exempted. We could talk a long time about why or why not. That makes a lot of sense, but we don't have time to, so we're not going to start it tonight. And then, when all that was said and done, and the famine is over, who has the money, the livestock, the land, and some people who owe servitude to the throne, to Pharaoh? Pharaoh does, by way of Joseph's dealings here. So the people basically, the government owns everything they have, and the nation was grateful to Joseph, because whatever they didn't have, they didn't starve to death. Like probably other nations around in that area probably did. We don't know the details. But they didn't starve to death. And so they were grateful to Joseph, even though Joseph had basically, through these dealings, had enriched the throne of Egypt and put these people in a position of being obliging. And then, when it was over and they started tilling their ground again, what happened? 20% tax. We don't like that kind of sound, do we? 20% tax. You raise your field, and you raise your crops and so forth, and you give 1/5 of it to Pharaoh, and you get to keep 4/5 of it. That's my math. That's a 20% tax. And they were grateful to Joseph because they were still alive. They were still able to grow crops, and life went on, even though there was a horrible famine for 7 years. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, 17 more years after he's talking about here about his life to Pharaoh. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time drew near and Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. This was a way of making a pledge in those days. Totally foreign to our culture, but that was part of their culture, as part of making a pledge to someone. Whereas we would, or we used to, would make a handshake. Nowadays, people want a lot more than that generally. Please do not bury me in Egypt. There was a special place back in this promised land, and that's where he wanted to be. But let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do, Joseph said, I will do as you have said. Then he said, swear to me. And he swore to him, so Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. And there was a very, very powerful agreement there between father and son, because the father wouldn't be around but he still wanted his bones buried there. And did that happen? Yes, it did. Back in the cave of Machpelah, where all the patriarchs and their wives are buried except for what wife? I told you this would be a trivia question one of these days, okay? Who was it? Rachel, okay? Don't know why. You know, you think, well, let's get her down to Machpelah too, but they didn't bury her in the cave of Machpelah. So, but everybody else is buried there, and Jacob said, that's where I want to be buried. Joseph said, don't worry. See, Joseph was the one in charge. He would make that decision, had the power to carry it out, and it was carried out. Okay, now chapter 48. Take a look at the time here. Oh, we're doing all right. Doing all right. Chapter 48. Jacob blesses Joseph's sons. Again, something that is not part of our culture. And we really struggle to appreciate the meaning of these things that this patriarch said to his sons shortly before he died. Now, he's not going to die the minute these words come out of his mouth, because there's more said as these chapters continue. But he was close to death, and this was his time. He was clear-headed. He knew death was not far away, probably, and he gives them the blessings. It came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, indeed, your father is sick. And he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob was told, look, your son Joseph is coming to you. And Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. That happens sometimes, doesn't it? Even if someone is not sick unto death, there can be someone coming, there can be good news, there can be an event in which they're able to, it just, you know, it gets the adrenaline going to some extent, and they can kind of recover for at least a little while from whatever they're sick with, and because of this special thing. You know, your son, one of your sons, and two grandsons are coming. And no doubt he knew what was going to happen. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply, and I will make of you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting promise. So, the nation promise and the land promise, and not mentioned here as clearly as in Abraham's promises, at least in this part, was through him, through his seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed, but we know that happened. And now your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. And as Reuben and Simeon shall be mine. So he says, they're not grandchildren, these are my sons. You know, both of them. They were special. And all of us who have grandkids, we know how grandkids can seem pretty special sometimes. Well, Manasseh and Ephraim did. Then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. In other words, Jacob mixed it up. You put your right hand on the oldest child when you blessed them, the eldest. That was again part of their culture. And you put your left hand on the younger son. And so Jacob gets it backwards. He puts his right hand on Ephraim, who's younger, left hand on Manasseh, who was older. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom the fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel has redeemed me from all evil. Bless the lads, that my name may be named upon them in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Okay? He puts the blessing on. Got them on the wrong heads. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am dying. God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow. Okay? So, not included in there, for, again, the sake of time as we discuss it, is Joseph said, wait a minute, Dad. Switch those hands. You got them on the wrong head. He said, no, son, I know exactly what I'm doing. Okay? Now, as we read through the Old Testament prophets in different places, what tribe was used as a synecdoche for Israel, a part for the whole? What tribe? Because it was huge. Ephraim. Okay? Ephraim is a cake half baked or not turned. And it wasn't just the tribe of Ephraim. It was Ephraim representing all 12 tribes, all of Israel. At that time, they were unfaithful. You know, they were trying to pretend they were God's people when they were worshiping idols. And so they were condemned for that. So a number of times in the Old Testament, especially among some of the prophets, it's Ephraim, because Ephraim became a very large and powerful tribe within the 12 tribes. And so Jacob knew exactly what he's doing. Now, Ephraim did not become that because Jacob laid his right hand on his head. He became that because that's what God intended, right? But Jacob somehow knew that. Remember, God talked to Jacob directly. And we aren't necessarily told everything that he told him. But Jacob knew. He said, this son is going to excel this son, even though this son's older. And so this Ephraim became another synonymous word for Israel in some Old Testament passages. Interesting. All right, chapter 29, as we continue to move on here. All right, here are the things that he says to his different sons. And we could spend, I'll bet, weeks talking about why these descriptors were used. And so we're not going to. We don't have that time. But it's interesting. Each son, as he talked to them, Reuben, unstable as water, shall not excel. Who was Reuben? The oldest son, right? And what do you expect of the oldest son back in those days? He's going to be the one that shines above everybody else, going to be blessed above everybody else. But Reuben was not. Simeon and Levi, cruel, will be divided and scattered. Not talking about the sons, but their descendants is what he's talking about. And what did Simeon and Levi do when their sister was abused back in Canaan? They took some awful vengeance on them, didn't they? Okay, so they were perhaps earned that in some ways. Judah, the scepter shall not depart. Scepter, royalty, the king, the one to whom Jesus, the Messiah, was going to come, the king. Then all these others dwell by the sea, strong but lazy, a viper in the path, bites horses' heels. Very interesting here, and it would be perhaps a quarter study to talk about all of these phrases that Israel used to describe the descendants of his various sons. But we'll not have time to talk about them. So let's move on. Jacob speaks to his sons. Then he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. That's the cave of Machpelah. That's who they bought it from. In the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. So they bought this. This wasn't land that anybody was going to go back and take away from somebody. Remember, Abraham paid for this land for this specific purpose, knowing that God had made this promise. Hey, you know, Abraham, today, this is not on the map of your territory, but someday it's going to be. Okay? This is going to be part of the promised land. So Abraham knew that this was not going to be some isolated little Jewish property here for lifetimes to come. It was going to be part of Canaan. And it's the way, of course, it turned out to be. They are buried there, Abraham and Sarah, his wife. They're buried there, Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah. And he doesn't say why he didn't bury Rachel there or take her back there. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. A little history lesson here for them. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So now he's passing away. I think we're going to read some more about what he did here in a kind of a non-chronological way. But he gives these blessings to his sons and insists on being buried back in the promised land, the land of Canaan. All right. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. Egypt, as far as we know, was a rather advanced society. They had a whole lot of superstition, but in some ways they were advanced. And embalming was not something that was done by many, many cultures back then, but it was in Egypt, obviously. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. The Egyptians and the Israelites began with this close and happy relationship. All that they could think of was, there's a blessing. We want to be one. And when somebody special to them, he'd been there 17 years, their patriarch, their leader died. And so there was mourning there as well. My father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying, in my grave which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. Joseph to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. Again, we see the closeness that is so foreign to the situation that's going to be there, 490 years later, when they're slaves, and the male children are being thrown into the Nile when they're born, and when the Israelites were feared and hated. But it started out very, very different. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite, his property for a burial place. Okay, a little bit of repeat there. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who went up with him to bury his father. So they stayed there. Now, 17 years later, what's happened to the famine? 7 good years are over, famine's over, long gone, but that's home to them for a while. And as Kendall pointed out, this is where they're going to grow into a mighty nation. This stable place, this fertile land, already somewhat wealthy with animals, Jacob was, and his sons, and that's where they would continue to grow and thrive for a long time. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. There could be a difference. Some people could be like that. I'll be kind until, Dad's gone, but boy, when he's gone, I'm going to get vengeance. So they sent message to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. They didn't come with a specific plea. They sent their father's plea, which probably would have been more powerful, right, than if they made the plea themselves. Dad, wanted you to forgive us. But of course, all that was unnecessary because he had. Now, please forgive the trespass of the servants of God, the God of your father. And Joseph wept when he spoke to them. This is an emotional time for Joseph. And Joseph wept. His brothers also went and fell down before his face and said, behold, we are your servants. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God. God was in charge, as Kendall mentioned. God was in charge when he allowed his brothers to mistreat Joseph. Joseph said, I'm not in God's place. So Joseph dies, and his bones are going to be carried up there too, but a lot of years later. Okay, at 110. All right, thank you for being with me and being together for this study of the book of Genesis. And next week will be the beginning of the book of Exodus. Appreciate your comments and attention.